Hi, thank you for joining me on another episode of the Tech Exec Podcast, where I help you create a team worth leading. As always, I'm your host, Ben-Yosef, advisor and consultant to tech execs worldwide. And our subject today is crutches. Before we get to that, I've got two things to remind you. One, if you're listening to this in your ears, still in audio form, I'm doing this video experiment, so there's a video version available. You can see in the show notes the link for the YouTube version. And second, I've got a new free live session. As you might know, I try and hold one every 2-3 months for my audience. And this time, it's about cracking productivity. Why can't your team improve? What's holding you back? And this is a repeating theme that I've been seeing a lot of people complain about. So I decided to focus on that a bit. Okay? Check it out. It's free. And even if you can't attend live, you can get the recording. However, as with the previous time, I'm holding it the same day in two different slots, one for European time zones and one for American time zones. So you don't really have a lot of excuses not to attend live and ask your questions. Okay, and now let's talk about crutches. This is actually a recurring theme for me because I've been talking to people about this as a way of diagnosing problems we have in our leadership for years now. I remember that when COVID hit, I told people they're now discovering a bunch of leadership crutches that they had, like being able to, stick your head in a room and see if people are focusing on things or not, right? And first of all, I wanted to be aware of what the concept means. Crutches, as you might know, is something that we rely on, we depend on, we put our weight on. And if you're doing that too much, you're harming other areas of your body because you're allowing that crutch to help you too much. If you're recovering from surgery, sometimes using the crutch too much will mean that your recovery is going to take longer, for example. And with management, we can actually see it all over the place. One example is what I think many of you will find very close to heart if you come from a technological background and your company is still relatively small, and that is that we find it very easy to focus on the tech parts of the job. We use tech as our crutch. We use that as our own personal metric yardstick. Even if we don't comprehend that, that's our yardstick to show that we know what we're doing, that we are experts. For example, if you think about recently in discussions, how did you show your thinking and how were you involved? For too many VPs I work with, their mode of operation is to try and find all sorts of areas where their tech knowledge still applies and try and show that they understand what's going on, which is fun. However, as leaders, as VPs, I would like you to be able to show your worth in different ways. Like, do you understand the strategy? Can you think about processes? That sort of stuff. Okay, so that's one. Another example, which is a very recent one that I just saw somewhere, is where a leader had too much reliance on process. He was really not good, or it wasn't easy for him to coach. And therefore, he ended up relying on this process muscle way too much. He would just reach and say, okay, if something's not working, let's add a process there and let's add a process there. And it got to the point where he actually had several people in the organization who were in charge of implementing processes for months. And, when you're having an organization that's not huge, having people dedicated to creating more processes, making sure the processes keep running and making them more and more and more elaborated to tackle every little edge case that comes up, that's overkill. And when we have that, because we don't know how to coach people, we look at, we have only this hammer and all the problems seem like nails. That's the crutch. Now, sometimes, actually, we don't need to have an explicit process for whatever might happen. No, we might just need to be able to talk to people and talk about why something happened, coach people to not have the same sort of issue and fix it like that. Not everything has to be solved with more processing. So that's the process crutch. And one last example is when you have someone who's not the best fit in a specific role, but they're good enough and you can allow yourself to sort of cover for other things they were supposed to do. And you actually have them turn into a crutch. Maybe you have someone who is in a management or leadership position who ought to be more strategical, but they're not. And you allow them to shine in their tactical abilities and you cover for their gaps. However, just because you can do it right now doesn't mean that's the right thing to do, especially long term. Maybe you have someone who you promoted from IC to engineering manager, from engineering manager to director, and you see that they're really not there yet. They have issues. And then instead of having them improve, instead of coaching them, instead of replacing them, what you end up doing is using them as a crutch for the things that they do well, whatever those are, and trying to cover with your other crutch the things that you know how to do in order to make things fly for longer. But that doesn't make sense. You need to stop using those crutches and go to the real thing, handling the root cause, being a leader, making the hard calls, coaching people, deciding how your organization ought to be, understanding that when you have bad leaders, that affects the entire organization under them and people, across the whole from them. You can't have that go on for too much. So these are real examples of crutches, all I've seen recently, many of them I've seen repeatedly. And what I want you to think about is, which crutches do you have right now in your day-to-day? What are you doing to cover for other areas that are a bit too hard for you? And the point is not that you have to be great at everything. That's not possible. And actually, you should rely on where you have an unfair advantage. However, for everything, we must be aware of when we're doing that and when we cross the line where it no longer makes sense, because then it turns into a crutch, into a dependency that is going to harm us down the road. Okay? So keep that in mind. Try and think about an example. If you have any, do share. My email is always in the show notes, and I'd love to hear what you're thinking. And as always, thank you for joining me. Check out my newsletter where you kind of get a bunch of new material and lots of different media forms every week, and the new live stream I'll be doing in a couple of weeks. Thank you. See you next week.